Fiona is a disability advocate, a practitioner, speaker, and writer. She chairs the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields, and she is also a trustee of Inclusive Church. She leads the planning team for their annual partnership conference, which is now in its 9th year. Fiona has designed this series, and I'm now going to ask her to explain more about it and to introduce our panel for today. Fiona, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon. Hello, good afternoon and welcome. Much of my work in the last 10 years has been behind the scenes, making things happen, holding space, drawing in new voices, and encouraging people to create change. I guess I've been working more rather than talking or writing, knowing that the work is always the most important thing. And that sense also that we have of who am I to say this, to write this, to do this, to question this. But I know what I know because I live it, have prayed it, and try to honestly describe it in a way that might help others to hear it, to encourage others to speak, or to understand, or to act. I've been speaking up and out a bit more this last couple of years and have had a really positive response, but I'm still looking round to see who else people are looking at. It feels like quite a step change to be bringing these ideas to the Heart Edge platform this season, but I'm delighted to be here today. Since 2012, I've been helping to shape an annual conference, which is for rather than about disabled people. It's a partnership between St Martin in the Fields and Inclusive Church, who hold the framework of a space, a day where disabled people gather to share experience and ideas. The majority of planners, speakers, delegates are disabled or neurodivergent, though we also welcome parents, supporters, and those with a professional or other interest. Our primary purpose is for disabled people to come together and find common experience, story, and be able to return refreshed and encouraged to our own contexts. Disabled people gather to resource each other and the church. During the pandemic, like many people, my colleagues and I have connected regularly online and developed new connections, support networks, and found ways to be around the barriers, because this is what disabled people do. We live in the gaps and find ways to survive, to encourage and to resource each other. We have each shared experience of renewed discrimination, of new barriers, of being overwhelmed, overlooked, and excluded, of being shut in, shut out, and shut up. I spoke with friends and colleagues about our particular experience, and we were wondering how we could speak our truth and share our ideas more widely. We've all felt the need to call out what is happening, what we know and what it feels like, to share something of our experience and ideas more widely. We'd previously talked about the idea for new spaces where disabled people can talk to each other, but also share our ideas with a wider audience, particularly in the church. Heart Edge have generously offered us a platform to begin these conversations today. I'm delighted to be opening this first session of this first season with my friends and colleagues, Naomi Lawson-Jacobs and Rachel Noel. Typo. Dr. Naomi Lawson-Jacobs and Reverend Rachel Noel, you have both been so much a part of the evolving, thinking and planning. Thank you for generously learning and doing this together, and be willing to be guinea pigs today. Dr. Naomi Lawson-Jacobs is a researcher, disability advocate and trainer whose PhD on disabled people's experience of churches was published in 2019. Naomi is currently co-writing a book on disability, churches and social justice. Reverend Rachel Noel, known locally as the Pink Vicar, is priest in charge of St Mark's Church, Pennington, in the Diocese of Winchester. Creative, colourful, enthusiastic, autistic, ADHD, bipolar, and vulnerable to COVID, she's passionate about diversity and inclusion. Rachel leads a church that has embraced online and is excited about the potential barriers that are being opened up this season. I'm going to invite Naomi and Rachel to begin by saying something about their work and experience, and then together we'll explore today's topic, disabled people, church and coronavirus. Naomi.
Thanks so much, Fiona. So I was smiling when you introduced me as Dr. Naomi Jacobs, because like many disabled people, I think, I forget my achievements in the mess of the way that society sidelines who we are in favour of more kind of normative ways of being. I'd like to start by explaining that I am a disabled person, more importantly than a doctor, with a long and tangled history of involvement in churches. I have a chronic illness that leads to a mobility impairment for which I use a wheelchair part-time and various other mobility aids in between. And I'm neurodivergent, late diagnosed autistic, and I have experience of mental distress. And I'm part of the planning team for the Living Edge conferences that are by disabled Christians for disabled Christians, with Fiona and several other of the people on the call. And my PhD research focused on the experiences of disabled Christians, partly because I wanted to know if I was alone in my difficult experiences of churches, and it turned out I'm not. And I interviewed a large number of disabled Christians and spent time observing churches and projects, and I'm now co-writing a book based on the research with Emily Richardson. And in my other life, I'm a researcher for Hot Edge.
Brilliant, thank you, Naomi. And Rachel.
Thanks, Fiona. As you said, locally people know me as the Pink Vicar for obvious.
Rachel, we've lost your sound and your movement, so there may be a problem with your signal at the moment. It looks as though Rachel may have lost her.
I've lost me, sorry, back again, here we go.
We lost you there, Rachel. Maybe you could begin and introduce yourself. We got as far as Pink Vicar, and then we were admiring the colour in the background.
Oh, fab. Sorry about that. My own lived experience of disability was growing up with severe asthma and allergies to begin with, and I missed about 50% of school. It's affected lots of life decisions. I was allergic to the floor polish at the Baptist church where I grew up, and that's how I started going to the Anglican church. My cousin forced me at ordination to admit that probably I really ought to declare myself as Anglican at this point. Later diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and then more recently finding out that I'm also autistic and ADHD and bipolar, which I think, as Fiona said, is code for creative, enthusiastic, passionate, intense, and full of energy. But it also means that I've experienced quite a lot of well-meaning church pastoral care. I suspect I'm not the only one here that will recognise that lovely head on one side and the really soft voice. And you know that at that point you've become seen as the needy one, and they are there to care for you. And there is something lovely about that, because people do mean to care. But it's also can be hard to be seen and to be treated as an adult within that, and to be seen as someone that can contribute, can lead, can be fully part of the community. So I have to say it's probably somewhat surprising that I now find myself years later actually ordained and leading an Anglican church in the New Forest, in a community full of amazing people, many of whom are on the edge in various different ways. And for me, I just love connecting and encouraging people, finding ways for people to connect and feel a part of our community. Fiona invited me last year to speak at last year's disability conference, and I've spoken in various places about neurodiversity, diversity and flourishing. And for me, I'm passionate about sharing stories, of connecting people, and of making it more possible for others to feel safe to share who they are. I guess for me, I dream of a world in which it feels safe to be fully ourselves and fully part of church, in which we can each share our gifts, our experiences and our vulnerabilities to encounter God together. And for me here, that means I'm now a priest in a parish that's full of a mix of kind of rural and estate ministry, in a grade 2 listed Victorian building with lots of pews and steps. Since starting here, we've been working on how we do make the church physically more accessible, but I think also more importantly, actually how we make it possible for a wider variety of people to be involved in leading worship, in belonging and connecting and being part of this community. It's still a grade 2 listed building with lots of pews. I think that's me.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. So that is our background, and we're now going to begin thinking about coronavirus. We're going to do this in 3 sections. So we're firstly going to be thinking about the context, the pre-coronavirus context in society, in churches, and in our own lives, the kind of situation into which coronavirus came. Naomi, perhaps you'd like to start us off with that. The kind of the ideas of where we were at pre-pandemic, both church and society.
So when I was thinking about this, there were kind of 3 things that came to mind as to what was going on in the context that is relevant to what's happening now. The first is that disabled people have been asking for different ways to do church for a very long time, and the pandemic has somewhat accidentally encouraged churches to do that, and some disabled people have benefited from that in various ways. Another is that disabled people have a long history of trying to fit into churches that are not designed for us, where accessibility is an afterthought rather than being built in, which can lead to traumatic experiences and people leaving church and all kinds of things on that kind of spectrum. And that many disabled Christians, both before the pandemic and during, have been finding new ways to be church to each other for quite a long time, including through online church and through things like the Living Edge conferences, where we reimagine churches as a place where we can fit in rather than being added as an afterthought. So my research and that of others shows that many disabled people have been shut out of churches for a long time, which of course doesn't mean that there's no good practice or positive experiences. I also found lots of that. But there was a consistent story of churches being designed for a very narrow norm of bodies and minds, and those who didn't fit that norm having to kind of push their body like a square peg into a round hole to try and fit in ways that were traumatic and caused sort of further impairment effects, and just became very, very tiring for a lot of people. And then coronavirus arrived and everyone was shut in, and this was a majority experience. And I think some people have started to think about our experience from that perspective, knowing what it's like now to be shut at home and shut out of churches. It's not an exact analogue of what happens to disabled people in church, but it's given some people an idea. And one of the things disabled people in my research were constantly asking for was for church to do things differently. So when they went to church and found that they were a bad fit because they couldn't see a hymn book because the assumption was that you would be able to see, or they couldn't stand for the gospel, which was the assumption of what you should do in a church, or they couldn't hear or understand sermons that came from the front, or they couldn't get in through the church doors in the beginning, or they didn't hear theology that valued their lives, which are different from some of the normative lives that may be more valued, they felt that they were a poor fit in churches, and for many of them it meant that they felt they had no choice but to leave. These traumatic experiences were not what they wanted to spend their Sunday doing, and it wasn't always what they wanted to associate with God. And I have much sympathy with that. I left church for about 8 years and have slowly managed to go back, interestingly, during the pandemic, because of the way that it has slowly allowed me to re-engage with churches in new ways. Lots of the people I spoke to were looking for different ways to access church, and for some that included some of what we've seen in coronavirus. So they wanted sermons to be sent to them on days when they couldn't leave their beds, or they wanted to stream church services and take part remotely. And there has been some effort of churches in the past to do things like streaming services, but putting church online has been seen by many churches as secondary to coming to the building. And it's still a case of there's sort of the primary ideal where we go to the building, which we have to hope will sustain us as the people that we are, or we might get a second best access. And the secular disabled people's movement has a slogan: nothing about us without us. In mainstream institutional churches, unfortunately, we're often used to the opposite. So non-disabled leaders talk about us. We're seen as opportunities for non-disabled people's charity, as Rachel was alluding to there. We're an object lesson for non-disabled people often, there but for the grace of God go I. And none of this is very empowering for us, and none of it speaks to our experience. And it leads us not always to be listened to. But there has been a movement of disabled people finding spaces that are our own spaces, very much on the margins. So for example, using the online space to create churches like Disability in Jesus and You Belong, and a number of other smaller groups that are less well known. The Living Edge conferences, which for me for several years was my church, because I wasn't accommodated as an afterthought, I was part of the planning, and it was such an affirming experience of who I am in the eyes of the church and God, if it's got right. And these new ways of being church to each other are about disabled people ministering to each other from the edge, from our position of marginalization. And they are ways in which I think we're starting to show mainstream churches that in more accessible environments, we can lead and we can have full involvement in the same ways as other people get. And we can be part of a transforming church that is more inclusive of more people. And online church is one way that opportunity is presenting itself. But for the most part, what my research was showing was that disabled people before coronavirus were not massively well included. And the problem with that was that when the accidental inclusion of coronavirus started, we're then left with questions of how much churches are actually thinking about us and how will they handle the removal of themselves from the online space.
That's all really helpful background, Naomi. Thank you for doing a PhD that just feeds so well into today's discussion. And Rachel, you're coming at it from quite a different perspective, aren't you? As the Church of England priest, as somebody who's theoretically on the inside, it's possible that your experience of pre-pandemic church and pre-pandemic society might be quite different. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. I think I would echo quite a lot of what Naomi said, really. I think for me, pre-pandemic, within the church, we tended to value people that could physically be there. And that kind of people you saw as really committed church people kind of were the people that could be there every week at a certain time and get, I mean, my curacy was in a multi-parish benefice with 7 churches, so you not only had to be there at the right time, but you had to get the right place at the right time, which was, I don't know, quite challenging. And as leaders, I think we had an expectation that was kind of a sign of a really committed person within a church. And for me, I think one of the things, my own personal experience have been at that, and I think for many others with disabilities of all sorts, that actually there are all sorts of reasons why that isn't always easy. And it doesn't mean that it's because you've got a lack of faith, which often seems to be equated that somehow a physical ability to be in the right place at the right time at a certain time and know in advance that you're going to be there at that time is seen as somehow connected with our kind of quality of faith. And I think my hope is that coronavirus this season has actually helped others realise something more of that. I guess, like as Naomi was saying, at the start of lockdown, suddenly everyone had their movement restricted and had limitations put on them of what was possible in day-to-day life. For me personally, it reminded me of my own experience years ago when sort of diagnosed with chronic fatigue and when recovering from mental health challenges. And I think one of the things that surprised me was in conversations with other clergy is that realising actually, and I'd not really twigged this before, but for many clergy, they'd never faced that sort of restriction. And so hadn't necessarily got their own personal or close family experience of that. And although for me, it gave people a little taste into the world of disability, for me, it was kind of, well, Jonathan and I were in some conversation, like, actually, we know people that have got experience of this. Like, we don't have to reinvent the wheel of, as a name thing, like the able-bodied people in the centre sorting it. Actually, there's people with experience that have actually got lots more lived experience of this sort of environment that actually have got things that can contribute, could help show others the way. And for me, my hope, particularly early in lockdown, was that it seems that many people would realise more about, for example, the social model of disability and realising how that makes the world different for people and not just the medical model. And I think in early days, some of that was there. My own journey with it has been early in lockdown was realising quite how many of the barriers to involvement, even from my own experience, I just kind of absorbed around how church is done in a physical environment. And I found in the first few weeks as we moved to online, being challenged of like, actually, I've absorbed some of those assumptions too, and realising, especially when we were starting to do pre-recorded content and things like that, that actually there was ways to open this up to people. If someone had 2 weeks in which to record something, they could record it late at night, early in the morning, inside, outside, however was best for them, and take part in a way that actually in a physical building we've not necessarily been willing to even contemplate that. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot of, sorry, I've probably got into the coronavirus question.
You slightly moved this on, but I'll pull us back slightly. I think for those who are perhaps not familiar with ideas like the medical model and the social model of disability, I might just kind of chip in there. So the medical model of disability is the idea that society is full of well people, able-bodied, non-disabled, sensorily intact, sensorily well people who all have the same sort of bodies, brains, minds, ways of processing the world. And that those who are different from that are kind of deficit, are broken versions of a healthy, well, normal person. So the medical model would say that society is set up in this way, and those who can't fit in this way, it's to do with them. It's to do with them, and they need to adjust, or they need to be kind of around the edges. The social model would say that human beings come in lots of different shapes and sizes and ways of being, that we're made, just as we're made tall and short and strong and weaker and faster and slower, we're also made in all sorts of brains and bodies that function in different ways, and that it's completely normal to come as a weak person or a person with one leg, or to break your spine. And where it's difficult is where society is set up by and for the well. So that's the medical model and the social model. The social model would say we are all made differently, and it's society which disables people by not providing for those differences and enabling people in these different shapes and sizes and ways of thinking and ways of communicating to take part equally. And so that's the social model and the medical model. And I would say that in many ways, the church, which you know, maybe in the 19th century was a leader, the church was one of those institutions which set up institutions, and the church led society in practicing faith in action, in feeding and housing and caring for people who would have died. Many of the institutions that kind of kept people alive on the edges of society were set up by people living out their faith. Many of these charities who've been working in among disabled people since the 19th century came from people's outliving of their faith. But back in the 1960s and 70s, the disability rights movement, people campaigned for greater autonomy, and that's where the slogan Naomi referred to earlier, nothing about us without us, came from. We don't want to be cared for or ministered to or looked after, except in as much as we all need to look after each other, depending on our various strengths and needs. But actually we want to have some say in our lives. We want to decide what we want to do and when we want to do it and how we want to do it, as far as we are able. So the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. At that point, I think the church, for whatever reason, the church has been much slower to adjust. So the church is now quite a way behind society in its treatment of disabled people. Not all societies and not all churches, because of course there are differences, but the church is still stuck, I think, often in the charity model of kind of caring for people and people needing to be cared for, in the brokenness model. But brokenness as being a weakness rather than brokenness as being a strength. If Jesus was broken, yet somehow disabled people, those who come with weakness, are somehow in deficit rather than practicing vulnerability or living vulnerable lives. And so the church has got a fair way to go. I think every church, every community, every disabled person, every neurodivergent person is somewhere on this spectrum of understanding and practice, and none of us have arrived. And part of what's valuable about the conference each year and these conversations today is that we all bring the experience of where we are, what we know, and we bring and we share those things together, and through doing that we grow understanding from each person who's present. So I would say that the church had a way to go, but there were things happening, particularly on the edges of churches. Society had a fair way to go. I mean, only 30% of the London Underground has got step-free access, for example, and it's pretty hard to get a blue badge. And let's not talk about the Welfare Reform Act of 2012 and how many things have gone backwards since then. But we were in a certain point, and that was a position at which coronavirus arrived. So I'm going to invite Naomi perhaps first to say something about the advent of coronavirus and those early days and months, and then Rachel, and then we'll come back to the idea of where we are now. So if we talk about that impact of coronavirus and those issues and ideas, either in church or in society or in your own lives. Is that okay? Naomi.
Thanks, Fiona. So two things come to mind. You'll hear that I always summarize my points before I say them. It's my organizational brain. Two things come to mind here. The first is the kind of general social context of COVID-19 leading to more marginalization of an already marginalized disabled community. And then the slightly different context of what churches have been doing through moving online and finding ways to worship remotely, and how that has accommodated or not disabled people. So COVID-19 has increased inequalities for disabled people, and as you were mentioning there, Fiona, while the disability rights movement is a thing that has existed for a long time, we are very far from equality in society, and we have come out of a period of 10 years of very severe austerity, which has impacted a lot of disabled people in terms of health and social care and financial equality with others. And then COVID hit, and we've seen a rise in difficulties of disabled people accessing food and medicine, barriers to accessing PPE like masks and gloves, which put people at risk when they had carers at home, something the government didn't talk about at all. Issues with accessing information like in BSL or in Easy Read for those of us who need information differently. And if you think about the situation of coronavirus, information has been incredibly important, so to be shut out of that has been terrifying. Deaths, as we know, have been significantly higher for disabled people. We know about how care homes have been ravaged, which include many disabled older people and disabled younger people. And statistics, although statistics are a bit fuzzy on this because we don't know to what extent we're talking about pre-existing conditions, we do know that disabled women are about 11% more likely to die than their non-disabled peers, and disabled men about 6.5% more likely to die, and those statistics will get clarified as we go on. So we have been in a situation where a lot of us have been absolutely terrified, not helped by things like healthcare policies that have made us worry about the rationing of treatment. I've been one of many people who've made healthcare passports during this period, which is a document where I essentially beg for my life, which I carry around in my handbag at the moment. It's really, really terrifying. And now that things are moving on a little bit, we continue to be talked about as though our lives are less important than non-disabled people's, even if that's not the intention. When things are said like coronavirus only really affects the elderly and vulnerable, it's suggested that our lives are less important if they are lost, rather than saying if we all protect each other, then nobody has to suffer vulnerability to this illness. And more recently, we're seeing a rise in hate crime against disabled people, and this is not actually unexpected because disabled people are often scapegoats at a time of societal crisis. But there's been concerns, for example, that people are being attacked if they're not wearing masks for medical exemption reasons, or people are being called virus spreaders with a misunderstanding of what vulnerability means. And there's been massive health and mental health impacts as a result of all this, which reports are being released on all the time. And many of us predicted that after lockdown and on an ongoing basis, a two-tier society would emerge, where those of us who are shielding or trying to protect ourselves from the effects of the virus are having to take the brunt of staying indoors, and everyone else is being encouraged to go outside. And there's much less kind of policy concern about how to reduce the virus in society. And disabled people's history is all about being shut away from society. And the idea that we now have no choice to self-isolate is one that I know a lot of us are finding very troubling. And then we've got the completely different context of churches, who have massively risen to the occasion when it comes to keeping congregations connected during lockdown. And because of majority need, as I mentioned before, churches have arrived kind of en masse in the online spaces, which many disabled people were already using to create church out of necessity for some time. And this is the kind of situation that gets disabled people's access needs noticed, as Fiona was mentioning, because if something becomes a majority need, it's taken a bit more seriously. And the Church of England has been delighted by the high numbers of people engaging with online services. 5 million people watched the first official Church of England Sunday broadcast, and high numbers have continued. And there has been some conscious work on disability accessibility in some of these broadcasts. But for the most part, as churches have moved online, I would say there's been a lot of what I would call accidental accessibility. Church online, while it's not accessible for all disabled people, by no means, for example, a lot of deaf people and autistic people are having some issues with that. Church online is more accessible for many disabled people. And in fact, a lot of disabled people in my research had been asking churches, as I mentioned, for things like sermons for a long time. And there was some rumblings, and not just among Christians, among many disabled people about, you know, we've been asking for this kind of access for a long time, and suddenly it's happening en masse very quickly when there was resistance for a long time. So many more people have been joining from their beds than ever thought they could before. I've spoken to many people in all kind of levels, if you like, of church, from ministers to lay people who've been excluded for a long time, who've been re-engaging in new and exciting ways. But when mainstream churches moved online en masse, there were a mix of reactions for disabled people. Some disabled people were very excited about the new opportunities this could create for them for us to be able to be full members of churches, to minister to each other, to help churches reimagine what church could look like. So for example, I spoke to pioneer ministers who had been shut out from their ministry for a long time and had suddenly had the doors open to them again. And to people like Laura from You Belong Church, who said that she thinks that there will be far more ministry opportunities for disabled people in the future. But other disabled people have been concerned about the way that the mainstream church have taken over a space they've been using for a long time without consulting them. And I'm thinking back to what Rachel said about how we have so much expertise to offer the church at this time. And some churches have been working with that expertise more than others. Katie Toppling of Disability Jesus has been talking about her concerns about the way that churches have moved into mainstream churches. And as we'll go on to talk about, I think in the future, there have been a lot of concerns about what happens when the church pulls out of this online space, having kind of taken it over in this way. So there's a number of different issues.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Naomi. As ever, you're amazing at summarising so many complex points into a very short period of time. I'm also aware that I tend to speak fast when I'm short of time, and we've had a couple of requests in the chat to ask us, all three of us, to slow down a bit. So I will mention now, and then please wave your hands at me if I get fast again, and I'll try and remember to do the same to you guys. But luckily, this is all being recorded, and so people will be able to watch on catch up if there were points you wanted to pick up later on. Thanks, Naomi. Rachel, what would you like to share about church and coronavirus?
Yeah, I guess like Naomi said, that accidentally accessible bit is, I think, was something really exciting, that it almost forced churches to actually realise they could do this in a way that I think those things kind of were perhaps bubbling, but always put slightly in the too difficult or next month or next year kind of box. So for me, there's some really exciting stuff that's happened with some of those opening up, but I think probably like Naomi, fears of in this season now, what's going to happen with that. But I think particularly the accidental opening up was just, like I said earlier, that barriers changing, that you could be involved in all sorts of different ways at different times. Suddenly, I mean, in our church, Sunday at 9:30 is the sort of the main service, for want of a better word. Well, Sunday mornings at 9:30 don't work for everyone. They don't really work for me. So I'm allowed to say that. I'm sorry, I'm talking fast. I'll try and slow down. I think one of my concerns that's been there during the coronavirus season is that quite a lot of the language that we've been using in our churches hasn't always been helpful. And I think that's still going on now, particularly a sort of emphasis on getting back to normal started to emerge. I'm not sure, I don't know, normal I find a particularly unhelpful word at the best of times. The language now seems to become finding the new normal. And I'm slightly scared that in the stress and pressure of that there's a danger that so much of what we've noticed and learned and kind of accidentally stumbled into in coronavirus gets lost in the fear and scarcity kind of language that dominates. And I understand that. I'm a church leader who's feeling slightly bowed under by risk assessments for a church and a hall and how we get things open. And we do want to do that safely, and that is important. But sometimes in that stress and the fear, actually it's hard to actually keep hold of the really exciting, important things that have been opening up. I think the other myth, so I think the new normal is one of the myths that's been, I think, really unhelpful. The other one for me is a deeper one, I think, around the language of together that's been going on. And people kept harking back in coronavirus to looking forward to when we're back together Now, I don't know about you, if you remember that wonderful, beautiful panacea of church in 2019 of us all being together, but I suspect many disabled people don't recognise that panacea of together church in 2019. And it's not really a togetherness of church that I'm really excited to be going back to, because I think the together of 2019 wasn't very together. And my fear in the language that's being polished of us being back together, that it closes down our noticing of the ways in which we weren't together before coronavirus, and perhaps closes down our noticing of how we go forward. And for me, those sort of shiny rose-tinted spectacles that we've been polishing lots, I think, during Corona season, because people have wanted a certainty and something to hold on to. But I wonder again, in the stress of anxiety of this season, if that together language and that new normal language, we might find it harder to be willing to challenge the status quo. And I think particularly this season, as things like furlough are ending, finances are getting tighter all over the place, those that find it harder to fit, far harder to work, those who don't fit in all sorts of different ways, those who were shielding's being paused, whatever that means. It's not like there was a magic wand on the 1st of August that made any of us less vulnerable to COVID. But anyway, shielding's being paused, which is kind of being a societal way to kind of go, we don't need to care about you anymore because the world is back to sort of some sort of new normal. And I wonder, for me, as in the early days when restrictions affected everyone, as restrictions started to ease, but people, I mean, I remember people, as restrictions started to ease and I was in the shielding category, being like, I haven't even yet got to what you've had available to you all through lockdown. It's sort of, so as it's that kind of inequity in this that has been so wide for so many people and for so many people for so long. And I think the able-bodied are perhaps seemingly less able to see that or to hold on to that in this season, amongst so many fears and anxieties for so many different reasons for different people and different institutions. So I guess for me, it's that language that I think has developed through Corona season that, well, I guess for me, the language of season has probably been the one that I've been using to find it more helpful, as it indicates perhaps ongoing changing, seasons change. And I think for me, it's that noticing seasons and being aware and letting ourselves learn from those seasons. My fear, where anxieties have got big around buildings and a focus has gone on buildings, is, are we going to start seeing individuals as problems again that are too complicated to fix, rather than enjoying the blessings and trying to open up and more of the ways in which we have been able to connect? And for me, I think my biggest fear is that churches will just go to kind of putting a camera in a building and going, well, we're doing online now, look, we've got a camera just letting you see what's going on in the building. And I don't know about others, but I certainly found as the world opened up in Corona season, whereas in the early days with meetings with friends was always on Zoom, what happened was that actually other friends would go and meet together and I would be on Zoom to 5 people in a room somewhere else. And actually I felt more distant once others were together and I wasn't with them than when we were all in this online world. And so for me, I think there's some more stuff for us to do of noticing in this season of actually how do we involve people on the edge in these conversations. It's easier to have the conversations with the people that come into the building and for their voices to dominate. And it's kind of, that's not actually, I don't know. I'm really excited with things like this conversation of how do we connect with others that help us actually keep noticing these and these questions and conversations and what is possible.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. We're going to move on in a second to kind of current and begin to signpost forward. For those of you who haven't been party to it, we're actually having a season 2 in November and we're revisiting each of these subjects, disabled people church, coronavirus and neurodiversity, and we'll be going in some depth. And one of those conversations will be looking at coronavirus with the kind of focus of post-pandemic church. So we'll be looking forward. Next month we'll be looking at this subject again and looking forward. I think I would summarize some of the conversations we've had just there from Rachel and Naomi about being around autonomy and vulnerability. I think, Naomi, you might have touched on the idea that somehow within coronavirus in society more widely, disabled people have been gone back to being perceived as inherently vulnerable, whereas a recent UN report said that it's actually attitudinal, environmental and institutional barriers that result in situations of vulnerability. So there's a particular learning point for the church there in having had years of talking about vulnerable adults, and actually vulnerability is always to do with context. So autonomy and vulnerability is one, expense is another, and afterthought would be my third. I know that we're all aware of things opening up and adjustments being an afterthought, adjustments being an expense, of blue badge spaces disappearing under distance tables, or widened pavements, or narrowed roads, or bicycle lanes. And I think that we have to be careful to ensure that as church communities, adjustments are not an afterthought, but that as we move forwards, then we have a hybrid understanding that each time we're developing the new normal, we're perhaps thinking about how can we open these to people who come with a range of experience and needs. So I'm looking forwards then, or indeed to the current time, with a little hint of forwards, just before we break into conversation groups. Perhaps just briefly, we could each say something about where we are currently, just for a moment or two. Maybe begin with Naomi again. Thank you.
Yep. So there's two things that I'm aware of currently. One is a great deal of worry from disabled people about what happens when churches leave the online space and how they do that, which you and Rachel have both touched on. I love what Rachel said about us going back to being problems when we were part of the big problem that we were all facing. We now go back to being different, and a lot of work to accommodate, which is often how I feel in churches. And a number of people talk to me about the issue of how invisible they felt before, and not feeling so invisible anymore, but the fear that they will go back to being invisible and only get second-class access to churches. And disability and church activist Kay Morgan-Gurr said, "It's taken a pandemic for the church world to catch up with the need for online church and access. Yet today I still see ministers and congregants alike saying that online is second best, and they look forward to getting back to real church." A number of people repeated this sentiment talking to me, this eagerness of returning to real church, as though the kind of access we need is second best. And the problem I think with that is that we will always be in a position of second best if this is the way that the church is thought about, with this model of being in the building being the ideal, and this add-on idea of how do we help people get into a building. But the other way of thinking about it is to turn the model upside down and say, what are the different ways that we are church to each other? Does it always have to be completely focused on buildings? Does it always have to look the same? What are lots of different groups doing as the world changes in many ways, including the digital world, to be church to each other? There is a big focus from mainstream churches now on returning to buildings. The Church of England keeps talking about engaging the large numbers of people they've seen online in buildings. I suspect they won't see most of those people, because there will be lots of reasons why those people might have found it safer to go to an online service, everything from disability to having children who they aren't always accommodated in churches, through to having very busy lives and maybe not being ready to carve out a space for going to church yet, and those intimidating doors of the church, which not everybody is used to going through or knows what's behind them. And I think the church should be taking the opportunity to ask how we should do church differently. And if we did do it differently, how would we do it in a way that prioritized justice for those who we failed to reach in the past, who are suffering very badly in this pandemic, but who have never had this complete access to churches, only second best access. I think that we need to, particularly in a time when many of these people will remain sequestered in their homes long term, we need to think about what's been gained through, as Rachel says, doing services so differently, when people can record their section whenever they want to, and the church service can be put together in a whole new way because building's not constraining us. COVID-19 could give the institutional church a chance to completely transform, but we must make sure that all the kind of good intentions we've had are not reversed when, as Rachel said, we're focusing on, how to get back in the building and the stress of that.
Great, thanks, Naomi. Again, you've beautifully summarised a very complex area very quickly, which is brilliant. We're going to move to groups in a minute, but first of all, I'm going to invite Rachel to share where you think we are currently, with a little hint going forwards. Do we have Rachel? Rachel may have frozen. And one of the points that I know Rachel and I were talking about previously, we've got Rachel back again. Yeah. Hi, Rachel. Would you like to share very briefly
Sorry about my internet.
Going forward? Cool.
Yeah, I think I echo Naomi really, particularly about, for some people, online church is church, not a virtual second best, and a life-giving gathering of prayer and worship. And I think for me, that's really important. And I think I feel like we're just at the beginning of encountering that, not the end of encountering that. And I think my fear is that many, I think, clergy are feeling burned out by that and looking forward to familiar. And for me, it's how do we open it up and be willing to take the risk of allowing more different people again, perhaps to be part of thinking how we do church together in different ways that just kind of works for different people. And I guess for me, it's perhaps that myth of togetherness that actually, again, where we're so attached to the togetherness, again, buildings accidentally kind of sneak in as being priority. How do we sit a bit more lightly to that and to perhaps more varied different ways of what it means to be together? And in physical buildings, we're used to that. We're used to kind of 8 o'clock congregations, and even some congregations really not having very much overlap. And we've come to accept that. And I guess for me, it's actually how are we willing to let church perhaps diverge in different ways? Now, I think it's helpful what you've said, that actually for some people, they do want to see what's going on in the building and feel more connected with a in-building church. And I wouldn't want to stop that. And but it's being willing to perhaps, I don't know, I'm not quite sure. It's exciting, but also scary, because actually we can't all do everything. So, but again, the world of online has opened up. Well, I guess, for example, like this meeting, a year ago or 2 years ago, it's more likely that this sort of thing would have been done in a place, and you'd have to know that you could actually get to the middle of London, say, or the middle of a big city to go to it. So not only would you need the energy for the meeting, you'd need the energy and capacity and confidence that from when you set out at home in the morning, that you would have all that you needed until you got home at the end of the day. And this season's opened up, you don't need to know that. I mean, you could come onto this and you could actually be overloaded after half an hour and log off and join in later on record. I don't know. I'm really excited at what that opens up now. It doesn't perhaps look like what we've seen before, but are we willing to keep learning together, I suppose, in different ways?
Brilliant, Rachel. Absolutely brilliant. Exactly that. I don't have to come out as a wheelchair user unless I choose to, because you can't see where I'm sitting, you can't see where I'm at, you can't see anything about me other than how I come across right now, which is often slightly scatty and not quite focused, but trying to hold it together. I think there's some really key points there that we've brought in together around what is worship? Are we watching or are we worshipping? What is worship and where is God? What has the church got to say about this? What is the church practicing about this? Where is God? Are we worshipping? Are we witnessing? Are we watching? Is God only in the middle with the priest? Are the people in the congregation simply watching what the priest does? And if not, then why are the people at home any less worshipping God or being part of the service? And those are questions and perhaps exciting new theology. Maybe the pandemic is about the church being broken open, being broken and shared. And those are ideas we could perhaps take forward to another time. I'm going to go around very briefly and get Naomi and Rachel too to give us one last thought. What one idea, one thing, one thought would you like people to take away from today? Naomi.
I heard from disabled priest Emma Major during the later part of my research, and she wrote in the Church Times, will the good intentions of accessibility still be in place in a year's time when most of your congregation are back in their seats, or will we be the invisible again? And I really want to leave the churches with that challenge. I understand that this is often felt to be a very difficult area, but this is a fantastic time to listen to people. So please listen to our voices.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. And Rachel?
Yeah, I think it's similar. It's that how do we keep having the confidence, A, to have conversations together and to find ways for these voices to to be heard and to have the courage to speak in our churches and communities. Yeah, so I think it's that. It's because I don't think one conversation is ever going to sort it. It's having the courage to keep talking together and keep learning together and finding spaces for that to happen together and in our own community. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you, Rachel. The courage to speak, because I think where we began earlier on today, where I talked about how me having the courage to come forward and thinking, who am I to say these things? But actually, here we are, 37 of us still on the call, and who knows who's going to follow up. We are hugely grateful to Naomi, the Reverend, the Dr. Naomi Lawson Jacobs, and the Reverend Rachel Noel, Rachel and Naomi, my friends, for generously sharing your work and your wisdom today. We've all learned something, and we'll be understanding something and connecting perhaps, and perhaps acting differently going forwards. And we look forward to hearing from you both again later in the series. And thank you all for taking part. We've all have something to contribute to these conversations, and I hope you've enjoyed being part of this one today. As I said earlier, this is the first of 6 conversations. We begin with these 3 Fridays in September. Then we take a break for October as we slave away over the conference, which is on October the 17th. And then we'll be back for season 2 in November to dive a little deeper into each of these subjects. Next week, we'll be exploring neurodiversity in church with special guests Anne Memmott and Naomi and Rachel Noel. Anne Memmott is the author of the Church of England's Autism Guidelines, a national advisor on neurodivergent inclusion, and works with a variety of organisations nationally. She is a regular contributor to Radio 4's Prayer for the Day. She's also a very valued member of our conference planning team. And we welcome Rachel back with her to exploring her experience of being shut in, shut out, and shut up as a neurodivergent person. We've now come to the end of my script, which must mean it's time to hand back over to the Heart Edge team to lead us in signpost to the Heart Edge things going forwards. Thank you.
Yeah, so Ben has dropped lots of links about Heart Edge events into the chat. Someone also noted in the chat that if you go to the 3 dots in the bottom right corner of the chat, you can save the chat to your own computer. So that's the simplest way of keeping a record of all the information, a huge amount of useful information that's been dropped into the chat in the course of this workshop. So I just want to add our thanks to you all for coming and for all that you've shared with us today. And as Fiona says, we invite you to join us again next Friday. So thank you all for being here, and wish you all a good weekend. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.